Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Steve Parrish. I'm the co-director of the New York Life Center for Retirement Income at the American College of Financial Services, and I want to thank you for signing in. I hope that you and your family are healthy and that you're getting through the situation at least adequately. So I suppose congratulations are in order. I'm going to assume that you've gotten through the November election, presumably in one piece. And we're really glad you took the time to continue your awareness and your education in such trying times. I will fill you in on the CE process shortly, but I first kind of want to set up what we're covering today. So we scheduled this webcast to discuss retirement planning issues in light of the November elections. And although we tried to give it a little bit of time after the election, we wondered if we'd actually know results. Well, you know what? In some ways, it's positive for today's discussion that we don't know the exact finals of the elections. Our guests are experts in retirement planning, not pollsters or pundits. And so we want to talk about the trajectory, if you will, of the election. Now, our guests can help us on doing that, even if we don't know everything that is going on right now. But we want to talk about retirement issues in this post-election season without trying to describe, vote counts and measures as to who will do what in Congress and with the president. We're not here to talk about politics or speculate about the future. We really want to set the stage for where we are currently in the retirement planning process and discuss some possible directions going forward. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists, our guests. We have a great mix of practitioner expertise and retirement policy thinking. First, let me introduce Sandy McCarthy. She is the president of the retirement services at OneAmerica in Indianapolis. Sandy has an impressive background in retirement planning, not only as a practitioner, but also as someone who's studied international retirement system and has been active in EBRE's board of directors. And next we have Jack Towarnicky. Jack has an even longer time working in retirement planning than I do, and he has a great background in research and legal consulting and corporate plan experience. So without further ado, I just want to say, Sandy and Jack, thank you for joining us.
Hey, Steve, Sandy.
It's our pleasure to be here.
So we had this election, you may have heard about this 9 days ago, and yet we're still not 100% sure about the presidential transition and about whether the Senate will remain controlled by the Republican Party or not. But for purposes of our discussion today, we're going to assume that Joe Biden is the president-elect and that the House will maintain Democratic control. And my guests are not genies or soothsayers, but I think we can still comment on post-election retirement planning without knowing the exact political landscape. So here's the plan for today. What we're going to talk about is public retirement systems and Social Security and Medicare, private retirement programs, and we really have to take measure of where we are right now with the Secure Act and CARES Act. And then we'll talk about the private retirement system and programs going forward, including the possible Secure Act 2.0. And we definitely want to leave some time for your questions. So with that as kind of an introduction, let's get started with retirement benefits that deal with public benefits. Now, Jack, you've worked for many years in retirement policy, and let me tell you where I see the current situation, and then we want to know your thoughts. So the two big retirement issues dealing with the public benefits are health insurance, obviously, and retirement income from Social Security. Now, with health insurance, pre-retirees and early retirees may have to grapple with the issue of the Affordable Care Act. As we speak, and many of you are aware of this, the Supreme Court is currently reviewing the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. And while the latest we've heard, this was 2 days ago, is that several conservative justices have voiced skepticism about whether the entire law has to fall, there's still a possibility that millions may have to adjust their healthcare plans. Then we have Medicare. This law, I think we can all agree, is entrenched, and the issues revolve more around funding the plan and considering changes to help improve the long-term viability of the health plan for retirees. I'd like to avoid, an extensive discussion of this. It could go on forever, but I want to point out that the president-elect has been very clear that health insurance is high on his policy agenda, especially as it relates to the pandemic. And that will be an important consideration in any retirement planning considerations going forward. Next, we have the retirement income floor that is represented by the popular Social Security system. I have to laugh at the thought that when we talked about this extensively a few months ago with Senator Kent Conrad, there was a hurricane coming out of Florida, and he was actually broadcasting from a hotel for us. Well, we just had the most recent hurricane blow through here about 2 hours ago, so I don't know if that's trying to tell us something. But as we discussed in that earlier webcast, the challenge for Social Security is clearly funding. The Social Security Administration's trustee report earlier this year projects that the trust will be depleted around 2034, the year 2034, presumably leading to some kind of pro rata decrease in benefits in the range maybe of 25%. And then we have the Penn Wharton study that looked, it followed that report, and it looked at how the pandemic may affect Social Security funding and the projections. In one scenario, they project that the depletion of the trust fund could come as soon as 2 years earlier than what the trustees said. Now, at the same time, candidate Biden has proposed ideas to fund Social Security shortfall through increases in FICA taxes, the wage cap, and possibly to improve benefits for some of the lower wage side. So with that as an introduction, Jack, where do you think we're going with government-backed benefits in the U.S. retirement system?
Thanks, Steve. Let me start by making a comment that my comments are my own and really don't necessarily reflect the views of employers or groups or associations that I've been part of in the past or in the present or future. And today I'll mention a couple of different studies and articles, and if you need a copy or a link, feel free to catch up with me on LinkedIn. So to answer your question, just about 3 years ago, GAO issued a report titled "The Nation's Retirement System. A comprehensive reevaluation is needed to better promote future retirement security." That 2017 report asserted, and I'm going to quote here, "The U.S. retirement systems face major challenges. They are anticipated to be unable to ensure adequate benefits due in part to the financial risks associated with entitlements." In September of 2020, to your point, Steve, the CBO updated its estimates for the trust funds for the future for the 10-year federal budget period, 2021 to 2030. And they projected an additional $130 billion of deficits, essentially coming from the coronavirus pandemic. They projected that the reductions in Social Security tax revenue from pandemic-induced job losses would exceed any reductions from lower benefit payments. However, it really wasn't clear if CBO included anything in like dynamic scoring when they, in terms of adjusting for the increased turnover and the increased early claiming among older Americans. You might remember that just 12 years ago when we had the Great Recession, we saw much greater claiming levels of Social Security benefits once older Americans exhausted their unemployment benefits. This time we've got a lot more older Americans who've lost employment due to COVID. But importantly, this most recent challenge from COVID only sharpens the focus on our long-term funding deficit, our inability or unwillingness to achieve sustainability. And we've known about this going back to the Clinton administration, to President Clinton's 1993 executive order. And that GAO report offered nothing other than let's have another committee. There simply isn't any agreement on what actions to take. And to be honest, there's not even agreement on what's going to happen should we exhaust the trust funds. That is, if Congress fails to act, the statute doesn't include any specific requirement about how benefits are going to be affected. No reductions necessarily across the board or proportional or some kind of progressive reduction in benefits. And because of a conflict in laws, if monies aren't available to pay benefits, it might simply mean that the liability keeps growing. because the portion that can't be paid today would by law simply be deferred and payable at a future date. And if so, that's going to add to our challenge, and that's going to make tax increases instead of like a reduction in benefits that much more likely. Current administration, President Trump's administrations promised no increases in payroll taxes, no reductions in benefits. And while President-elect Biden has suggested substantial new OASDI payroll taxes on high-income Americans, he also supports substantial benefit enhancements for low-income retirees, widows, widowers, and our oldest Americans. And finally, he also wants to extend Medicare eligibility to folks ages 60 to 64. No one can really predict what would specifically happen, and he didn't include in there any communications, any suggestion as to who's going to pay the premium in order to make that happen. Most of us don't really recognize that the Medicare premium, if you add in the A, the B, and the D, comes out to something close to $17,000 a year on average. And yeah, that's the average annual cost of Medicare and without any supplement. We have made a little bit of progress on the funding gap, but not much. For Medicare, President Clinton approved removing the cap on FICA med taxes back in 1993. President Obama added a surcharge as part of health reform. Both of those new revenue streams help to shore up the hospitalization insurance trust fund. Remember that Part B and Part D come totally out of general revenues. Part A, the hospital coverage, is in the trust fund. And that trust fund will now be exhausted in less than 5 years. So tick-tock.
Let me ask one other question before we move to the private side. Are there other federal or state public benefit systems programs that we should be thinking about as we look into this post-election season?
Yeah, my only real comment, and move on to the next slide, is to review Pew and other studies on the funding status for public employee pension and retiree health care plans. Now, this is just an article November the 7th in the Wall Street Journal on retiree medical challenges. Now, funding for public employee pension plans is better, but it's still a challenge in a number of states. The unfunded commitments are at historic highs, and some project that those funding gaps could increase by over a third due to investment performance and reductions in tax revenues. They note that, and I'm going to quote here again, the disparity between well-funded and underfunded state retirement systems is greater than it ever has been. So you would think maybe the states and local governments might be in the mood to reduce benefits, if you will, because they're already going to have to increase taxes to fill the gaps. But unfortunately, a lot of states have provisions in either laws or in their constitution that preclude reductions in benefits.
I hear you say good luck, Illinois. Well, let's move to the private side. And Sandy, I'd like to ask you first about what you've seen in employer-sponsored retirement plans now that we've had the Secure Act for, wow, 11 months, hard to believe. We'll talk about the possible Secure Act 2.0 later, but where are we right now?
Hello to everybody. It's really great to be here with you today. And as Steve introduced me, I really have more of the practitioner side. Given that I've been in the business for over 30 years, the majority of my time has been spent working in organizations like OneAmerica and largely helping sponsors and advisors think about how do we implement some of this, right? So there's the practitioner side of things. You know, what I have up here is, I'm going to go down memory lane a little bit just to set the stage, but I certainly won't go into detail. If I think about the acts over time, they certainly have set the stage, as also have been building blocks in how we consider and think about the legislation that's either been passed or in front of us right now. So I'll just go back actually to the Pension Protection Act of 2006, because I think that was such a critical piece of legislation. You know, you think about it, I remember it was just about 400 pages of legislation that we had to evaluate. And I remember it so well because I remember exactly where I was sitting when it came out. But honestly, there's three things I believe that were strong building blocks in helping us to pave the way. One of those would be setting the stage for auto features, which have had an incredible impact, right, in terms of the readiness in retirement. And actually, a plan sponsor DC survey I just looked at says that auto enrollment in 2006 was 17%, and today it's at 33%. So, just again, a proof point in terms of how that legislation was impactful. Second is the increase of the deferral limits, and again, on a ramp-up basis, 10,500 for 401k plans in 2001, up to the 19,500 in 2020, and that's not counting the catch-up provisions. And then the third, actually, which also has meaningfulness to me, is the fiduciary relief on investment advice. And the reason I mention that is I remember conversations prior to 2006 where sponsors were asking, I would love to offer advice, but I don't feel comfortable because of the fiduciary role that it presents, right? And if you think about it in today's place, it is commonplace, right? We're seeing the majority of sponsors feeling very comfortable, and it's really helped, right, to pave the way in terms of preparing individuals for retirement readiness. So then you go forward over a decade later. I mean, amazing that it took us that long, but here we are with the Secure Act signed into law just about a year ago by President Trump, December 20th, 30 provisions. Some are optional and some are required. So one of the things I would call out is in my role as a practitioner, it's about how do we help the sponsors and the advisors understand what it really means to them? How do we put these types of actions in place? When I look at this recent Secure Act, what's exciting to me is I look at it in three components. One is accessibility, which certainly has been a key component part of the acts that have been done to date or completed to date, signed into law. But I think about the two new categories, lifetime income and longevity. And why I think that is so important is because we're starting to recognize the holistic, right? The holistic point of view about retirement readiness. Accumulation has been first front and center, and we're looking now at protection and decumulation as something that's really meaningful, especially as baby boomers are retiring, right? The questions we hear over and over again are, what do I do with my money, and will I have enough to last my lifetime? And so I think these types of activities that are happening within the Secure Act are really phenomenal. I'll just call out a couple of the small business options with MEPs, multi-employer plans, and PEPs, which are pooled employer plans, provide accessibility for a group of small businesses. Also, the auto escalation going up from 10 to 15% cap is something that will help. And then part-time workers, looking at them as an employee type, right? How incredible is that for us to think about the different types of employees who need access, again, accessibility for retirement savings. Lifetime income, again, here's this parallel path to what I heard back in the PPA 2006. Fiduciary relief of investment advice created that opportunity for people to create products and services. In the lifetime income, it's fiduciary relief for the selection of a lifetime income product. Now, more has to be done in terms of definition, but it certainly is setting the stage for some really good activity in that space. I think the portability component of that is important, as well as the requirement that was put out there to estimate expected monthly income if it's paid as a lifetime income solution. So again, setting the stage, paving the way, how do we define it? Some of the provisions were meant to be for 2020 and some go into 2022. What have we seen? Again, education is critically important. Staying connected with our sponsors and our advisors. What I've seen to date is, and some of this is the result of 3 months later having the CARES Act, right, as in response to COVID. So we could begin to have the conversation, but as we all know and as we all feel, COVID is taking hold, and the CARES Act was much more important for sponsors to focus on. So with that, I would say MEPs and PEPs, The small businesses are still looking, and the advisors are looking at a wait and see perspective. I would also say the same is true for in-plan and out-of-plan income solutions as a result of the fact that we need more definition. We have, what I'm excited about with that perspective on lifetime income and longevity is that we're able, and we're working on some things on an incubator mode at OneAmerica, to be able to incorporate that into the participant end-to-end strategy, which will, at the end of the day, have true meaningfulness in terms of the way participants are selecting and identifying options. It's tied to a persona perspective driven by some life event decisioning, and really good way to connect with individuals. I'll just say one more thing about the CARES Act, and those provisions certainly have been a high level of focus for our clients. Distributions are at twice as many as we have seen the year before. So there you have it, right? Money is flowing out as a result of what we're experiencing. It was not optional for RMDs to be suspended, which was, I believe, great action. But the other part of it is that we're seeing significant call volume, 50% more than we've seen in the past. But the questions that individuals are asking are all around market volatility and how should I invest and how do I need to budget. So again, the practitioner side of this is how do we connect and support our clients at all levels to make sure that we're doing our best for retirement readiness.
That's helpful. I mean, it's insightful to know what's really going on, what the calls are. And speaking of insightful, you have a background that would come in very handy in this post-election period as we think about retirement planning. Is we are the world. There's a lot of different pension plan systems around the world, and you've worked in it. Can you give us, how we fare internationally as far as the various kinds of pension plans out there?
Yeah, happy to do that. I'll make a couple comments, and on the next slide, look, this is one of my favorite pieces of research that's been done, and it does what it does do. And you can certainly look this up on your own. You can Google it, and there's a PDF out there. It is the Melbourne Mercer Global Pension Index study. And what it does is it looks at three categories, evaluates and ranks based on adequacy, sustainability, and integrity of system. And if you look at the chart, you can see where the US is. We're rated a C+. I won't go into the methodology, but essentially, as Steve indicated, I did have an opportunity to run the Asia Pacific business for Mercer, and I lived in Australia. So much of my time was spent looking at the superannuation and working in the superannuation market. What I always find interesting is they call them schemes. And so when you look up scheme in the dictionary, it has a couple of different meanings. But we'll go with the one that is a large-scale systematic plan. So in Australia, the superannuation head start with the program in terms of compulsory, mandatory employer contributions, right? That is really the key component of that. And it scales up to 12% above wages for employers to contribute. And on top of it, it has a voluntary pre-tax contribution component. The other part I would say is financial planning was adopted really early on. So again, I go back to that financial advice in connecting with the individual. The other piece that we're working through right now is the multi-employer plan structure, which was adopted quite well and allowed for individuals to connect on an industry basis where it resonated. So I would say that in comparison in the US, I think we're on the right track. We're graded a C+. I think we can get that up there. And I think that's true because accessibility is there, right? We're continuing to look for ways to increase that. The longer term view is going to have a great impact on final retirement income. But I would also say there's something else that's going on that I'm seeing in the market, and that is employers have a heightened level of interest and acknowledgement for their desire to help. So I was looking actually at a Bank of America survey. It's their 10th annual workplace benefits report. And they're saying 62% of employers feel extremely responsible for employee financial well-being. And that is up from 13% in 2013. So I think we have a lot of positive momentum, and the factors that I just mentioned will help drive, continued progress.
Yeah, perhaps the pandemic made them more aware of those kind of issues. Let's do this, Jack. Let's go back and follow up on the Secure Act. Now that we have the Department of Labor actually came up with rules, as we've discussed, for the lifetime income benefit statements that Sandy was talking about, do you think it's going to be a viable approach, and will it help consumers better understand how to convert their 401k retirement pot of money into a lifetime income? Is that going to happen?
Yeah, viable approach, sure, yeah. But or maybe you meant valuable. If you meant to say valuable approach, I'm a little less enthusiastic. The illustration converts the current account balance into a single life annuity and a 100% joint and survivor annuity. And that's true even for unmarried folks, and it assumes a spouse of the same age. It also assumes that you're going to commence this annuity at age 67. Those kinds of income illustrations, and this is where my 31 years in plan sponsor roles comes in. Those kinds of income illustrations for an uncertain, distant, unlikely retirement are going to be a little disappointing when they first show up. They're certainly not going to prompt participants who are under age 67 to start thinking about purchasing a deferred annuity commencing at 67. And importantly, the projections may end up misleading as much as they inform. So just think of it this way. Let's say that we had put this projection model, this lifetime income projection model in place as part of the original ERISA legislation 45 years ago. Think of the impact of the double-digit inflation and interest rates in the 1970s and early 80s. Or how about the last 12 years where we've had next to zero interest rates and less than 3% per year inflation? The other thing to keep in mind, and this goes to some of the comments that Sandy made about folks having access, is that Congress really didn't anticipate that we'd have turnover. And importantly, if you look at our government data, the Bureau of Labor Statistics information, it'll confirm for you that for individuals, workers, ages 25 to 64, the median tenure has been consistently less than 5 years for the last 5 decades. And since these projections only apply to employer-sponsored plans subject to ERISA, they don't apply to IRAs nor to pension plans. So think about the variance that's going to show up when people cash out or do a rollover to an IRA. Remember, at least according to the Investment Company Institute, most of the money Americans have added to IRAs since the Tax Reform Act of '86 has come from rollovers. No, the goal of the mandated disclosure, the lifetime income illustration, was supposedly to get workers to recognize the need to save more. So you might want to advance the slide here. The DOL's interim final rule, the one they just issued, confirms that they believe it will, and I quote, encourage those currently contributing too little to increase their planned contributions and to save participants some time in understanding how prepared or unprepared they are for retirement. However, if saving is the goal, we know what works. And Sandy mentioned it just a minute ago. Automatic features, perennially applied. Let me confirm just how ineffective this mandated disclosure may be if the goal is to increase savings. I often cite this study the DOL relied on back in 2013 when they first proposed a lifetime income illustration via regulations. And guess what? They cited the exact same study in their most recently issued guidance to implement this provision as part of the Secure Act. The study they cite looked at people at the University of Minnesota who received a lifetime income disclosure, and at the same time, they were given specific instructions on how to increase their contribution rate. So the study confirmed that instead of 96% of the participants ignoring the disclosure, instead of 96%, it was only 95%. They cited that 1% increase and they put it over the 4 in the denominator, and indicated it was a 29% increase in the response rate. And so what we're talking about is instead of it being a 4% response rate, they got a 5% response, or the control group, they got a 5% response rate. And folks, how did they respond? Well, they increased their contributions by all of $85 during a 6-month period of time. And then think about the university's demographics. Average age, about 45. Average tenure, about 12 years. Average salary, about $60,000. And everybody was already participating in the plan. That's not your typical American workforce. Keep in mind that when you have a voluntary enrollment plan, not an auto enrollment, only about 60% of eligibles contribute. In fact, less than 50% of those who earn less than median incomes, less than $50,000 a year, contribute. And about 40% of those under age 45, or those with less than 5 years of service, don't contribute. So under these rules, these folks get no statement. And the statement doesn't account for inflation. And those who participate in plans where the employer contribution is subject to vesting, the projection includes monies that may be forfeitable. So, you know, is it going to be viable? Yeah. Is it going to be, you know, really valuable? I'm not sure.
It helps. And let me just have one follow-up question before we actually look at some proposed legislation with Secure Act 2.0. The one thing we know from the Secure Act is, first of all, that it basically confirmed that the big player is going to continue to be defined contribution plans, but with the annuity provisions and the lifetime income statements are trying to, Sandy, you called it holistic. I'll just call it DBI's, the DC plan. Jack, do you think that there's that's still going to continue the basic trajectory of that the government's going to go, or are they going to try something new post-election?
Well, I really don't know how this is going to play out. I think a lot's going to depend upon, you know, whether or not they can get any kind of bipartisan activity going. A lot of people have suggested that once upon a time we had kind of like a golden age of retirement, as if everybody was covered under a generous defined benefit pension plan that would provide substantial retirement income. And move to the next slide here. My favorite examples are Professor Hacker's The Great Risk Shift and Professor Ghilarducci's book, When I'm 64. And Professor Hacker, who's substantially younger than I am, highlights a decline of economic activity in the 70s. And he writes that we've witnessed a massive transfer of economic risk from insurance and the corporate sector and government to the balance sheets of American families. Well, you know, I was there in the 70s and the 80s, and that's not what I remember about defined benefit pension plans. Yeah. I remember as my plan approached the 70s, it had age 35 eligibility, rule of 45 vesting, a 2% of pay employee contribution, a career average formula, no early retirement subsidy, and the benefits were paid in the form of a variable annuity where your benefit could go up or down, depending upon the investment performance of the assets inside the retirement plan. Bottom line, most Americans weren't covered under a DB pension in which they became vested. So Professor Ghilarducci, I think, comes very much closer. She correctly asserts the only way we're going to achieve widespread pension coverage would be through a mandate. I don't know that that's going to happen, but I really don't see a return to widespread pensions via DB-ification either.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and talk about some of the things that at least are being proposed. And specifically, there is the bipartisan Secure Act 2.0 that came up very recently. Because it's bipartisan, I think it has legs. I'll say that much. So Sandy, can you give us some thoughts on what it means for plan sponsors and for the participants?
Sure, Steve. Just on the next page, I've just listed a couple things. Again, to your point, you know, just a year later, further clarification, further expansion, right? And again, I group these in these categories because they're meaningful to me as well as to sponsors. accessibility, lifetime income, and longevity. But to your point, Chairman Richie Neal and Kevin Brady of the House and Ways and Means Committee, they work really well together. And that bipartisan support is really incredible. So October 27 with this Securing a Strong Retirement Act, which honestly, we expected to see that sooner, but with COVID, I think that this delayed it slightly. I would expect it to be a top priority for the committee after the new Congress is seated in January. I don't think it'll lose its momentum, but essentially it's taking what we talked about earlier one step further in terms of accessibility. What I like is it extends, as I've listed here, auto enrollment goes in automatically for new created plans. Now that doesn't happen until the end of 2021. What happens, from my perspective, that does entail quite a bit of technology enhancements that we need to consider at the same time. So it's nice for them to give us some lead time on that, not make it 12/31/2020, right? But that said, I like the fact that the nonprofit organizations are going to have more openness and expansion of capabilities that some of the 401k plans have seen already, and more clarity, I think, on that tax credit situation for small businesses to join MEPs and PEPs. The one that is also exciting to me is to see that student loan payments, because that's been such a top level topic for conversation with employers, that those student loan payments as elective deferrals for purposes of an employer match are out there in this act, in this proposal. So really excited from that standpoint. And also, a lot of what Jack said in terms of how do you get this lifetime income opportunity to really become a reality, and you say DBIs it, Steve. Well, I think that the rules are going to have to be expanded, and we're going to have to take any type of inhibitions out of that. So I'm excited for more definition around the lifetime income. In longevity, again, 1 year later, they increase it by 3 years. So they go from 72 for the required minimum distribution to 75. So it's certainly looking at how do we look at, what Jack, you just said, I want to retire when I'm 64. Well, people are actually working longer as a result. So it's accepting the new demographics and where we are. And what I'm excited about is that we're looking at the definition of groups more broadly that can benefit. And again, I always go back to that total retirement picture, because if you look at the total retirement picture, then people become much more ready to prepare themselves.
Right. Well, and Jack, any other thoughts on tax changes that may come up for the feds or the states? And I would include candidate Biden's idea of using a tax credit rather than a tax deduction on 401ks.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we think that we have a national retirement policy, that it's hanging on a wall somewhere, perhaps over at the Department of Labor. But in fact, what decades of experience tells us is that when push comes to shove, what we have is a policy pretty much focused on how to allocate those tax preferences, how to reshape those preferences instead of perhaps focusing as much on retirement preparation. With respect to the concept of changing from a deferral of income taxes into a credit, I'm not exactly sure how effective that's going to be. I mean, if you think about it, we have a credit for saving today. It's called the Savers Credit. And I don't think people are taking as full advantage of it as perhaps the authors thought that they would. It's important to remember that no matter what we do in terms of retirement-related legislation, that in all likelihood, states and local governments and the feds are all going to probably end up increasing marginal tax rates or increasing taxes one way or the other. It's ancient history now, but when President Obama was in office, we increased the federal debt from 10.6 to 20 trillion. And not to be outdone, President Trump in less than 4 years has grown the debt another 7 trillion. And regardless who wins the election, who finally wins it, projections are that we're going to add 1 to 2 trillion to our national debt each and every year for as far as the eye can see, or perhaps the CBO can project. So assuming federal and state and local income taxes will increase, making pre-tax contributions, that tax deferral, might end up subjecting some of that money to a higher income tax rate upon payout. And definitely it might more than offset any of the proposed nominal tax credit. As Sandy mentioned, though, I do think that Chairman Neal and Representative Brady on Ways and Means, as well as Senators Portman and Cardin, I think we're going to see some bipartisan efforts when it comes to retirement benefits, and maybe all four of them will get together.
And both of you talked about the issue for particularly the workaday person, and we have several questions coming up in the Q&A as well with the wealth gap. So Sandy, as you know, at the American College, we do this retirement literacy study, and we once again confirmed this year that prospective retirees and retirees are not very literate about retirement planning. You've been on the board with EBRI, and so you have that famous retirement readiness study. Where is the consumer right now as far as retirement readiness and going into the future period that we're dealing with?
Again, EBRI does do a retirement confidence survey every year. And to your point, literacy is not necessarily connected here with confidence, right? So 7 in 10 Americans, 69% feel confident in their ability to retire. But you'll note that only 27% feel very confident. If you look at, the line, it certainly is increasing over time, which is really good to see. It doesn't conclude why that's the case. But as I mentioned, as a practitioner, I expect that some of it is the confidence through some of the education and communication activities that are going on with employees over a course of a very long period of time. I also think it's the millennials understanding the need for this to be a retirement source, right? So I've seen study after study saying that the millennials certainly are much more further ahead about it. I also think it's the markets. People are gaining confidence around their understanding, albeit it's a very complex subject. The understanding of the markets has helped, but probably more importantly, I keep going back to that advice component. The trusted advisor plays such an important role for individuals in making sure that they understand where they are. And I would also say the comment that I made earlier with employers having a more increased invested interest. I'm not only seeing that from the Bank of America survey, but also Cerulli did a study recently, and the top priority for employers are improving overall financial wellness in employees was 43%, and closely followed by maximizing participant savings at 42%. So I think all of the convergence of all of that is really important. The alarming part here, though, is the last point, which is at the same time, 59% report that they either strongly or somewhat agree with the statement that preparing for retirement makes them feel stressed. So I actually have seen an increase in discussion around or a heightened focus on health and wellness expense, and whether or not it is to be considered as part of the total financial wellness picture. Fidelity had a point out there that the anticipated spend for health expenses in retirement is $295,000 in assets to cover couples post-65 healthcare costs. And then EBRI again says it's the #1 expense in retirement. Edward Jones says 60% of the people are worried about it, and 81% of the people from a Transamerican Luntz Global survey said they would find it valuable for advisors to start to factor this into the financial planning. So, I only bring that up because I've seen more heightened awareness of it over the last several months as a key component of financial planning. And I do think it's adding to the financial stress. And there was a Forbes article out there that said it's the vicious cycle. Is it the financial stress that's causing the health issues, or the health causing some of the financial stress, or vice versa? So, we've got to solve for that on top of everything else that's happening. So again, I do feel optimistic that we can get to it. It's just about how we focus and incorporate that into the discussion.
Great. And we're getting close to making sure we have time for questions, but Jack, kind of the same question. Looking down the road, where do you think retirement planning is going for the consumer right now?
Fewer Americans today, fewer American seniors are actually living in poverty than ever before. At least one study has the poverty rate for seniors, folks 65 and older, below 7%. And comparatively, that's a lot lower than, let's say, adults and children, younger or working age adults. There are other surveys like the ones from the Society of Actuaries that confirm that most retirees learn to live within their means and they adjust their spend as necessary, and that they tend sometimes to even hold on to assets so that they may be required to take distributions, but taking distributions isn't necessarily the same as spending that money. Sometimes they underconsume. There's a great little article in Forbes back on November the 5th by an author named Andrew Biggs. And I encourage you to Google search his or internet search his name, Andrew Biggs, for I think it's American Enterprise Institute. And he'll basically confirm for you that retirees they probably have a little bit more income than a lot of the surveys would suggest they would. What I would tell you is that because of the, as Sandy mentioned, the significant increase in the number of plans that have adopted automatic features, that the 401k's past is not its future. And because of that those automatic features, as she also mentioned, there's a lot of millennials who have essentially been tipped off, as opposed to those of us who had to voluntarily enroll when we were first eligible for our 401k plans. So I think if you think about it, to get people to save enough, we need to keep pushing innovative designs, perennially applied automatic features. And I also think to address the issue of wellness, financial wellness, I think we need to focus in on leakage a little bit more and essentially create liquidity without leakage. Most people are living payday to payday. If you look at like the American Payroll Association survey, 70% of Americans admit, at least the 30 some odd thousand in that survey, admit that they would have some or significant financial difficulty if their next paycheck was delayed 1 week, not missed. And think about that in light of the pandemic. And so, where I come from is that, well, I really do want them to participate in the plan. I do want them to get the employer matching contribution. And so I need to provide them access, what I call liquidity without leakage along the way to retirement. And I've written about this extensively and blogged on it in articles in Benefits Quarterly and the like. And so if you want more details about how that structure would look, certainly you can follow up.
And I put up your article on full auto kind of as the last comment dealing with withdrawals.
Sure.
A lot of change and a lot hasn't, but
yeah. So our biggest challenges in retirement really haven't changed all that much. Many don't have access to an employer-sponsored plan. Many who don't have access don't save in an IRA. Been a perfectly more than adequate tax-preferred retirement savings program available to all wage earners for the last 39 years. Those who do have access to an employer-sponsored plan sometimes don't enroll when first eligible. Those who do enroll fail to save enough. Too many folks take hardship withdrawals and post-separation pre-retirement distributions. And so one of my other comments, one of the other things that I'm looking for is that there are plenty of folks who have managed somehow to successfully retire. And in our post-PPA 2006 world of automatic features, I think that participants who need more retirement income need to get prompted or nudged, if you will, to consider available options for additional cost-effective, guaranteed, inflation-indexed income. And the studies I've seen suggest that one option middle-class retirees should consider is to use a portion of their retirement savings assets as a means to bridge them, to allow them or enable them to defer commencement of Social Security until either Social Security normal retirement age or age 70. And I myself, I'm looking for a plan sponsor who would like to, incorporate that kind of strategy as a default option in their plan.
A big amen to that one, Jack. I very much agree with that. Well, this has been very helpful, and I just want to point out that a lot of the things we're talking about are the kinds of issues we talk about in retirement income certified professional training. We just don't have the great level of expertise that we just hear today. It's great to have this to kind of accent it. So I want to encourage everybody to keep your education going. But in the meantime, we do have a few minutes for question and answer. First of all, thank you, Sandy and Jack. It's just great to get that kind of perspective that you have. But some of the questions related that I'm going to go ahead and hijack the answer and then ask you some other questions. But we had several questions about whether the CARES Act will be extended, whether the required minimum distribution will be waived next year. And I think my guests here would agree with me. It is so wrapped up right now with political issues that there's really not an answer. I don't think there's a grand plan that anybody's sitting on. We first got to get Congress to get together, sing Kumbaya, and make nice. So unless you have anything to add on that one, I just think that's one, stay tuned. A question that we did have, Sandy, that I think might help is, can you, we referenced it, but I'm not sure everybody knows why this might help with small businesses, the whole PEP and MEP area. What's going on there? I think people are kind of wondering, and by the way, what's the status? Because I haven't heard a lot since the CARES Act took over.
So in terms of the MEPs and the PEPs, as I said, MEP is a multi-employer plan. And there's two versions. One is a closed MEP and one would be an open MEP. And closed MEPs have been around for some time. And they, what happens in a closed MEP is it's industry specific. So the SIC code would be comparable. In an open MEP, there would be an ability for anybody to participate. And essentially, the thought there is that sponsors, and why it's attractive to small businesses, is that they can participate alongside others so they can share the expense. So the thought is that there's lower cost by participation. A pooled employer plan is a little bit different in that the structure of who is the fiduciary and who is the pooled, there's something called a PPP, a pooled plan provider, which is very different from a MEP structure. So it's who is going to take on the 331 role as a fiduciary, 338 role as a fiduciary, who will take on the administrative fiduciary role as a 321. So I know that I'm throwing out a lot of terminology to you, but I do have, and I don't know what the opportunity is for this group, but I do have a really nice chart that shows you the differences in terms of who has responsibility with each of the roles in a PEP versus a MEP. And so I'm happy to share that if we want to do that in a follow-up session. But again, I think to the point I made is small plans are looking to see if it really is an opportunity as our advisors to say, is this really going to be a low-cost option? Do I want to have more flexibility in my plan design? Because when you sign up for a MEP, you're using the same eligibility format, participation. And a lot of employers want to have flexibility there. So there's a lot of questions out there. I know providers are out in the news partnering with various organizations to say they're constructing MEPs and PEPs. But I think it's too early to tell what's going to happen with it. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that does help. And one other thing that you might be able to give us just a status on is the idea of being able to use annuities as one of the investment options. Obviously, they tried to take away or make it easier so that companies would feel comfortable using it. But are we waiting for regs, or is it just a matter of the industry catching up? Where are we with annuities and being offered in plans?
So again, I go back to some of what's been outlined in the Secure Act and Secure 2.0. I think we need more definition to have sponsors feel more comfortable with the fiduciary relief piece of it was big in that they didn't feel as though if they chose a specific annuity option, that they'd have the fiduciary risk. So I do think Secure 2.0 will help identify how they can expand the restrictions. What I have seen in my experiences, we've had a lot of stops and starts with organizations trying to build in plan or out of plan annuity options, and they haven't had much take up rate. And some of that is, I would say, as a result of the fact that the simplicity is not there. They're very hard to understand. And if you think about the participants at large, employees at large, we need to make it simple for them. And if they can't understand it, they're not going to move forward and purchase one. So we need to focus on simplicity.
Let me squeeze in one last question. I'm not sure if it's Jack or Sandy. An interesting question someone asked, and I thought that's a good point, is with the pandemic. Now people are much more aware of long-term care. I mean, just what can happen. Do you see anything in what we've talked about as far as future pension law, that kind of thing, that's going to incorporate more with long-term care features, not just retirement income? I know that's a very general question, but last question.
So I'll take a shot at it. I actually wrote a paper for the Society of Actuaries third quarter newsletter, the retirement newsletter. And the title of it was Funding Retiree Medical and Long-Term Care Costs for the Second Half of the 21st Century. And I think what you'll find is that there's many opportunities to prepare for those expenses. A couple of little data points. Sandy mentioned the Fidelity study, 290, 300,000 as a single sum to prepare for retiree healthcare for a couple age 65. But if you break that down into an annual amount, it's about $6,000 a person. So for a married couple, that would be, about $12,000, and that's primarily Medicare Part B and Part D premium and the cost of a Medicare supplement. There's a lot of Medicare Advantage out there that comes at a lower cost, but it has its own issues. And the other reason why that number is maybe misleading is that it doesn't include long-term care, and that's because 6,000 is a median number. The 300,000 doesn't include long-term care. And that's because the median American doesn't really incur a significant amount of long-term care expenses. But as our longevity continues to extend, as we continue to live longer as a society, more and more of us will in fact incur noticeable amounts of long-term care expense. One option that you have is to leverage the very tax preference benefit of saving in a health savings account. If you do that under code section 7702 cap B, you can actually pay long-term care insurance premium with your HSA assets. And long-term care expenses can be financed with their eligible expenses for your HSA assets. So those millennials who are just getting started, including my two kids, they are both saving in HSAs in anticipation someday that they'll be in perfect health and they'll be able to go spend this money on a boat. But if not, maybe have to spend some on long-term care.
Well, that's a good answer, and unfortunately, we have hit the bottom of the hour. So I really want to thank Sandy and Jack again. That was very informative, and we're going to continue with this. I don't have the date yet. Well, it's going to be in January, but we're going to talk about withdrawal strategies with some professors. So looking forward to that. But again, we will follow up with you, Sandy. We have several people interested in what you were talking about right there at the end. I want to thank everybody for listening and wish you all very good health as we go forward. And thanks for your continued education. And again, Sandy, Jack, thank you very much.